Recording. Great.
It's done.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to have Dr. Jiaho Chen for today's speaker of the ACID Institute. Dr. Chen is the Chief Technology Officer of the Parity and anti-racist startup that is building responsible AI solutions for enterprises. He was previously an AI research director at JP Morgan AI Research in New York, with research focusing on responsible AI, particularly in explanatory, fairness, and semantic knowledge management. He was previously a senior manager of data science at Capital One, focusing on machine learning research for credit analysis and retail operations. When still in academia, he was a research scientist at MIT CSAIL, where he co-founded and led the Julia Lab, focusing on applications of Julia programming language to data science, scientific computing, machine learning. Dr. Chen has organized JuliaCon, the Julia Conference for the years 2014 to 2016, as well as organizing workshops at New York IPS, SIAM, CSE, and the American Chemical Society national meetings. Jiaho holds a PhD in chemical physics, a Master of Science in Applied Mathematics, and a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry, all from UC. He was formerly a postdoc researcher at MIT, a visiting scholar at Rites Mikia at University in Japan, and a member of technical staff at DSO National Laboratories in Singapore. What year you were there? Perhaps I have to have a discussion. We may have been there at the same talk. Okay, Dr. Gio has written over 15 years, over 15 papers with over 800 citations, as well as over 100 packages from numerical computation, data science, and machine learning for Julia programming language, in addition to numerous contributions to the base language itself. His research interests include approximate dynamic programming, game theory, cyber physical systems, network control, and smart grids and safe autonomy. With that, please join me to invite Dr. Chen for today's speak. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And special thanks to Stacy for doing the AV walkthrough with me this morning, and especially to Binyam, who was my PhD intern back when I was at JP Morgan. Unfortunately, I'm having some connection issues, so if you just give me a minute to fix it, and I'm going to turn off my video just to see if this will help. Just 1 second. In the meantime, I emailed the slides to in reply to the email for the seminar announcement. So hopefully, in the worst case, everyone will still have the slides to follow along on Google Sites. Give it another minute, and if there's still more problems, I will just have to do plan B, I think.
Yeah, if you have problems, just go ahead and resend them to me, and I can just walk through the slides, and you can just tell me when to change.
Okay.
No
So Stacy, I emailed the links to you and the rest of the seminar email chain. So just let me know if you haven't received that, and I'll try to figure that out.
I do not have anything from you. If it was sent today, I do not have it, sir.
Okay. I sent it like maybe 10 minutes ago, so maybe it just hasn't arrived yet.
Yeah, let me double check that.
Alternatively, you can put the link to the chat box. And maybe Biniam, then you would like to share the screen. Like to put the links into chat box.
Sure. It's I don't think I have access to the chat, but it's tiny.cc slash tiny.cc slash
So I
parity.
just put a comment on the chat
Okay.
box so that you can see it on the right corner
Okay.
of your screen.
Okay. Yeah, I see it now. Okay, cool. Well, I'm sorry for the delay, but I'm just gonna go ahead and I think you're able to see part of my screen, so maybe I'll just go ahead. So let me see what the sorry about that. If it's okay, I will just follow along asynchronously with the slides that were shared. So I'll just go ahead with a little bit about me. So this is slide 2 for anyone who's following along.
Just give 1 second. We're gonna be
Yeah,
fixing
sure.
that issue 1 second. Biniam,
Okay.
did you receive that? I did put it in
Yeah,
the chat box.
I'm downloading it and I'm trying to share it.
You need to download it. You can
Yeah.
share it. Open it in Google
Yeah,
Drive.
actually, I can share it directly, but I thought that would be simpler. Yeah, I'm trying to share it now.
I want to have change of format when you download it and open it as PDF.
I think Stacy is sharing it right now. Yeah.
You're sharing a wrong screen if you're gonna switch the screen, CC. That's great. And just prompt SAC is going to be switching the slides.
Great. Again, apologies for the AV issue, but hopefully we can all follow along together now. So so a little bit about me on slide 2, if we can move to that. Yep. Great. Thank you. Yeah. So yeah. So this is us, the company. So sorry, is this okay now? Yeah. So this particular slide is just a little visual summary of where I was. I was born and raised in Singapore. I went to university at University of Illinois, and then I did my postdoc, and I was a research scientist at MIT, where I worked on the Julia programming language. In 2017, I left academia. I was a data scientist at Capital One, and then I became a research director at JP Morgan. And 2 months ago, I left to form my own company, Parity. So on the next slide, slide 3, you can see all the profiles of the people I work with. Yeah, so Liz O'Sullivan is my CEO. The two of us are part of the original team. Oh, we can stay at this slide. It's fine. Yeah. So yeah, maybe just in the interest of time, I'll just mention like these are the people we have, and then we can go to the next slide.
Okay, just let me know. If you just say next slide, I'll go to the next one when you're ready.
Okay. Okay, so we can go to the next slide about AI and trust here. Yeah, so this is the problem that we're trying to solve in the business. We see that AI is being used everywhere in various industrial applications, not just in finance where I used to work, but also in like social media. We also see like discriminatory bias in medical applications and all sorts of places. And the fundamental problem here is that when AI makes mistakes like this and they have discriminatory impact, it doesn't create trust, and people don't trust these algorithms anymore. And this is the high level of what we're trying to solve. Next slide, please. Yeah, so what we see here also is that this is a growing awareness that this is a problem. So first of all, on the top left, we see that there's more and more news coverage about what constitutes an incident with AI issues. So that's a publicly available website. You can go look at that, and it's been online for 2 months and already has cataloged over 1,000 incidents of AI causing real-world harm. We also see very promisingly the introduction of ethics guidelines to understand that if you're building AI systems, that you should be aware of ethical and societal issues. This particular website I've linked to is a database of AI ethics guidelines, which as of over a year ago already had over 173 guidelines. And those of you who have been following this space know that AI guidelines have continued to grow. New ones keep being published. UNESCO just published one 2 weeks ago, and just name one example. And finally, we also see that new laws are being put into place, not just in the United States, but also in other countries, such as the UK and the European Union, to put into place guidelines for the safe use of AI and having accountability when things go wrong. So next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm talking about responsible AI, and I know that a lot of people have different definitions for what responsibility means. I choose to define this as AI systems with all relevant stakeholders in mind. I would say like responsible AI is sometimes defined in a laundry list way, where it's about, oh, make sure the AI is fair, also that it's explainable, also that it's trustworthy, and so on and so forth. But the way I think about it is that there are different groups of people, different personas, different stakeholders that interact with an AI system. So in a financial context, you can imagine that a business team developing an AI system cares about profit, but then maybe there's a legal team or a compliance team that cares about discriminatory risk, and maybe there's a civic organization representing the general public, the target market, that cares about financial inclusion and making sure that financial services are available to everybody who wants them. Next slide, please. So I designed this for Zoom, so apologies. I think it might not be the same, but it looks like there are some reactions. But I'll go through like 4 questions that I have about financial services in the US. All of this is publicly available, so we can talk about them. So next slide, please. Can we just skip this, please? Okay, great. So first question, how many households in New York City don't have a bank account? So I gave 6 different options here. So anyone who would like to participate, please go ahead and use the reaction icons on WebEx, and we can, or like maybe type in the chat, or we can do this interactively. So anyone want to make a guess? Okay, so we have
34 maybe.
Okay, 34. Somebody in the chat said 11. Somebody said 45. Anyone else want to guess? Okay. All right. So let me summarize. So it's pretty clear that people realize that it's not less than 1%. There's quite a lot of households that don't have a bank account. And if you go to the next slide, we'll see the answer. Yeah, so the most recent study that I could find was from 2017, and in that study, 11% of households did not have a bank account. But actually, those who answered 23% were also right in a way, because these are households that have a bank account, but they make heavy use of alternative banking services such as payday loans and cash checking services. This is public data. You can go find it on the New York City website if you're interested. Next slide, please. All right, so the next question is, how many adults in the United States have a limited credit history? And here I define limited credit history, meaning that there's not enough data in your credit report to generate a credit score, which I hope many of you realize is very important for all sorts of users. All right, so we have a guess for 29%, 50%. Okay, thankfully it's not 50%. It's not that bad. All right, yeah, so here's the answer. So it's 14% from the most recent study I could find, which is published by the Federal Reserve in 2016, but it uses data from the US Census of 2010. So so this is why from 2010 we see that 14% of adults in the United States don't have enough credit history to participate in the normal way in the credit system. Next slide, please. This might be a bit of a sensitive question, but here it is anyway. JP Morgan Chase, the place I used to work at, has been around for about 300 years. And how many humans did this bank own? Right. Maybe I'll just move forward in the interest of time. So on the next slide, please. The answer that I could find online was about 1,250. And the bank had disclosed this in the city of Chicago because it was required by law to disclose any historical ties with the slave trade. So if you're interested in this story, there's a Wall Street Journal article about this, and also some other coverage from 2005 when they disclosed this information. Next question, please. So in what year were women in the United States allowed to open bank accounts in their own name without requiring a man's permission? Anyone want to guess the year? (1963) Okay. Anyone else want to guess? Okay. All right. So maybe we'll go straight to the answer. So the answer was 1974, and this was allowed by a law that was passed called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So in this law, this required that women were allowed to open a line of credit or a bank account in their own name. Yeah. So yeah. So this particular slide tells us about some reading that I thought was useful, despite this being a very complicated topic. I'll mention in particular that The Color of Law is a really good historical discussion of the history of mortgage discrimination in this country. And the Financial Diaries is perhaps well known for being the study that gave the factoid that many American households don't have $400 for emergency expenses. So if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend these particular books to look at. Next slide, please. This is where we are today. Despite a 50-year legacy of civil rights and other laws protecting consumers, we still see massive evidence of financial exclusion, both of women and racial minorities, and also subtle forms of structural inequalities that seem to be made worse by artificial intelligence. So next slide, please. So here are some of the questions that we can discuss today if people are interested. So why do we have people who care about fairness and explainability? We kind of talked about that, but also what are the examples of practical challenges that arise from assessing fairness? And does imposing fairness on an AI system necessarily come at some sort of cost in terms of business performance and accuracy? Next slide, please. Why fairness and explainability in financial services? Next slide, please. So banks need to explain how they give credit decisions to consumers. So you can't just say, I approve or deny, I have to tell you why. So next slide, please. Yeah, so next slide. Yeah, so for example, I may not like the job that you have, I may also give you other reasons. Maybe I don't like the gender you are. I don't like the fact that you have a variable income, or maybe I don't like the color of the car that you drive. Next slide, please. So clearly, some of these look like more acceptable reasons than others. And the specific decision policy that is legal depends on jurisdiction. But usually, there's some fairness or explainability requirement attached to that. So next slide, please. So let's pretend to be a bank and discuss some fictional policies. Next slide. So here's credit policy A. So if you're a man and you apply for a credit card, I will approve the loan. Otherwise, I won't approve the loan. So I'll ask people to comment if they think that this is a fair policy. Maybe we skip ahead to the next slide, please. Okay, no. Yeah, hopefully everyone can tell that this is an unfair policy. But let me just review like the legal basis for why this is an illegal policy. So the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which is part of the Civil Rights Act, defines protected classes, sex being one, race and age being others. And along with it comes this legal notion of disparate treatment. So making a decision on the basis of your membership in a protected class is not allowed. And so for this reason, this credit policy is illegal. Next slide, please. All right, so second credit policy. If I live in this zip code 27411, I will give you the credit card. Otherwise, I won't give you a credit card. And I'll tell you that zip code is not a protected class. So may I ask people to comment again, like, do people think that policy B is fair or unfair? Okay, people still say it's unfair. Okay, great. Next slide, please. So I think many of you know that there's this historical practice of redlining, and this constitutes disparate treatment under the law. So redlining was a historical practice when banks, including government-owned banks, literally grew maps like the ones you see on the left. This is a map of the city of Philadelphia. If you, maybe some of you recognize it, and they literally colored in red the neighborhoods they don't want to lend to, and in blue the neighborhoods that they want to lend to. And perhaps not surprising to anyone who is familiar with U.S. history, the neighborhoods they colored as red do not lend. Literally, the red line neighborhoods correspond to majority minority neighborhoods. So these are neighborhoods where the main population is a racial minority. And what's perhaps disturbing and of concern is that on the map on the right, this is a map of the census data from the most recent census in 2010, and you can still see a very strong correlation of being a majority minority neighborhood and being in a historically redlined neighborhood. So for this reason, we argue that zip code, because it is such a strong correlate for race, it's very easy to predict what race you are based on your zip code, that this still constitutes disparate treatment and therefore is illegal. Next slide, please. So here's the last one that we can talk about. So if your credit score exceeds 670 points, I give you the credit card. Otherwise, I won't give you the credit card. So ask people to comment again. Do people think that this policy is fair or unfair? Or if you're not sure. Okay. Okay, people are saying fair. Anyone want to argue that it's still unfair? Debatable. Okay.
Sometimes this is Stacey. Sometimes I think a credit score, there is some degree of unfairness because people who, especially younger people who are just entering the job market or who have really no credit history, it's very difficult to, in order to build a credit score, you have to get credit. And in order to get credit, you have to have a credit score. So it's kind of an oxymoron, especially for, I think, younger adults or young people or people who are just newly trying to establish credit.
No, I think that's a fantastic point, and I think the point you raised about first of all, credit begetting more credit. This is definitely a very important feature of the credit decision that has to be considered if you're building an AI system to decide who gets approved for credit. That's definitely a case to be made, that also credit score, because it depends on credit history, is correlated with age, and so there's a problem here. So next slide, please. So just to summarize where we were, according to the US theories of discrimination, this credit policy does not have obvious evidence of disparate treatment. There is no explicit decision being made on the basis of race, sex, age, or other protected class. But is there an implicit dependence? And that's exactly what Stacy has mentioned previously. So this is now related to a different legal theory of discrimination known as disparate impact. And disparate impact means that I have a neutral policy, superficially neutral, but this may still result in a discriminatory outcome. Next slide, please. So I thought this would be a good place to just review what is a credit score. So first of all, there is no such thing as the credit score in this country. There are actually multiple credit scores, and many of them come from this one company called FICO. And this number 670 that I pulled is the industry standard between what is called prime and subprime credit. So if you have 670 or higher, this constitutes good credit in general, and then anything below is considered not good credit. And this is what is officially published on the FICO webpage, that you can see that related to Stacy's point, 15% of your credit score is related to the length of your credit history. So that clearly correlates with age, because the older you are, the more likely it is that you've participated in the credit system. And then also payment history is 35%. And this is pretty also correlated with the length of credit history. So you could argue that something like 50% of the credit score is correlated with age. Next slide, please. So here are two studies that I want to bring up. So first of all, it is actually a fact that the distribution of credit scores is racially dependent. So this particular study from the Federal Reserve in 2016 shows that there are very different distributions for Black, white, and Hispanic customers in the United States. So I want you to focus on the right-hand boxes in each subplot. And everything in that box is what we previously mentioned as prime credit. So these are people with good credit scores. Now, what you see very clearly is that Black and Hispanic seem to be sort of even, like it's roughly 50-50 when you have like, that you might have good credit or bad credit. But for the white subgroup, you can see that the scores are very heavily skewed towards the good side, and that skew has increased over time. Even though as you go from gray to black to red, as time progresses, all the different subgroups are improving over time, but you can still see that historical difference continues to manifest 14 years after the first data points. So this is definitely one thing to think about when you think about implicit dependence and implicit discrimination. And then next slide, please. So the most subtle point is that just the fact that you're using a variable, like using the credit score itself, is also potentially racially correlated. So as we talked about at the very beginning, we talked about how not everybody has enough credit data to compute a credit score. And in fact, a different study from the similar group at the CFPB mentioned that the missingness of credit score itself has a racial dependency. So if you look at the right-hand chart, ignoring the different gradations of what it means to be missing, you can see that Asian and white behave very differently from everyone else. So for Asian and white, the probability that you don't have enough data to compute a credit score is about 15%, whereas for everyone else, it's closer to 30%. So there's almost a twofold disparity just by race. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we've talked about a lot of things that are not AI. You might be wondering, why do you just listen to a talk about fair lending and civil rights history and things like that? But I really think it's important when you're thinking about AI ethics and AI fairness, if you're designing an AI system for this problem, that you really have some understanding of the context and background of the problem that you're trying to automate. I'll just skip this slide in the interest of time and we can go on. So I think we have time to discuss one or two particular types of problems that we observe. So we'll see how far we make it through time. I'll start with this particular paper, which is called Fairness Unawareness and was published at the S2A2 conference in 2019, which some of you may know as a conference specifically focused around fairness in machine learning. Next slide, please. One of the problems in practice that we see is that we don't always know the class memberships. Like you may be a customer with me as a bank, but I may not know what race you are or gender you are. It actually turns out that it depends on which credit product you have. So for example, the Fair Housing Act requires lenders to collect the race and gender labels of applicants for mortgages in order that they can test for compliance and bias. But conversely, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which regulates all other consumer finance products, actually makes it very difficult for lenders to collect these same labels. So oftentimes you have a situation where I have a student loan with you, or I have a credit card with you, but you, the bank, don't know what race I am. So as the bank, how am I supposed to solve this catch-22? I don't know the labels, but I still need to compute if I'm biased or not. And one solution that has been used in practice is actually a secondary model to impute the labels. So next slide, please. So this goes by the name of BISG, which is a very fancy name for a very simple idea. So we're basically guessing the race of who you are based on your last name and where you live. And we're tabulating this against the census data. So in this example, I am interested in predicting the race of a person called Smith, who lives in this fictional California that has 10 people, 7 white people, 2 black people, and 1 Hispanic person. So what I would say then from BISG is to say, well, the probability that you are white is basically just the population fraction that we observe. So for all Smiths in California, the 10 that we have, 7 are white, 2 are black, and 1 is Hispanic. So the probabilities that output are just 7 over 10, 2 over 10, and 1 over 10. So next slide, please. Yeah, you notice that on the previous slide, we have a probability distribution, and we still need to convert this into a label. Like, for my analysis, I actually need an actual label, not just a distribution of possible labels. So what is often done in practice is thresholding. So you say that I apply a previously defined parameter, like 65%. And if I have more than 65% of Smiths in California being of a particular race, then I will impute any Smith in California to be white. So this is my rule for guessing what race you are. Next slide, please. Yeah, so you see one of the problems here, of course, is that it's not perfect. And in this case, you see that everybody who, you see that 3 out of 10 people are misclassified. And this is just an unavoidable consequence of guessing labels when you don't know the true labels. Next slide, please. So one problem that you have here is the problem of sample loss. So for example, if I'm now computing the same probability for this fictional New York, so let's say there are 5 white Smiths in New York and 5 black Smiths in New York. And if I set my threshold of imputation at 65%, we don't have a 65% majority. And so we can't use this in analysis. And that means that we're just not including New York in the actual bias evaluation. Next slide, please. Similarly, if you set the threshold to be very high, because you can imagine I want a high threshold because I want a very accurate answer. But this also means that I'm throwing away more neighborhoods that I cannot analyze. So going back to the previous fictional California example, if you set threshold to 85%, we don't have an 85% majority of a race. So we basically are not able to analyze this neighborhood and we have to exclude it from the analysis. Next slide, please. So why am I bringing this up? It's because we know, as a public matter of fact, that this is what the federal government is doing. So there was a case in 2013 where the CFPB fined a particular bank almost $100 million for having racially discriminatory car loan pricing. But now the question that came up was, how did the CFPB know? Because the bank, which in this case Ally Bank, they don't record the race of their customers. The car dealers may know, but they don't share it with the bank. So how did they possibly know? This led to a congressional hearing where it was revealed that they're basically using this sort of imputation method for compliance testing. And as part of the public disclosure, you can actually go to GitHub to look at the code behind this. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just to say that it blew up back in the time, and there was a lot of coverage and negative press, and a lot of angry Congress people writing reports about how this is bad science and so on and so forth. But just to go to the next slide, please, we'll just focus on one of the problems that was brought up. And this is really interesting question that two empirical studies, one published by the, I think this is the OCC in the center, and on the left was the third-party consultancy that was hired to redo the analysis as an independent agency. And both of them came to the same conclusion that using BISG in general, but not always, will estimate the outcome disparity. And so this fuels my interest in this problem. So why does BISG or imputation overestimate the bias? And is it ever possible to have the converse? Because in these two studies, they always saw an overestimate. But was it possible to ever have an underestimate happen? Next slide, please. So the spoiler alert is there are statistical errors, and the statistical errors give rise to the overestimate. And yes, it is possible to have underestimates. Next slide, please. So here we're formulating a very simple research question. So consider this definition of unfairness, which is demographic disparity. So in my loan decisioning problem, I'm just looking at the average rate of acceptance for an advantage group and subtracting that as the difference for the same acceptance rate relative to the disadvantaged group. So going back to the earlier example, this would be like how many mortgages did I approve for the white subgroup versus like the black subgroup, something like that. And of course, I don't know the true labels in this situation. So I'm actually computing this other quantity, which is the same differences, but not for the true membership of the advantage and disadvantage groups, but for the imputed, the guessed groups. And the result in our paper is that the estimation error actually comes from two distinct sources of bias, which we will talk about. Next slide, please. So one is what we call inter-geolocation variation, and we have a extreme example that we can talk about. So let's look at these two neighborhoods. Neighborhood A is a high income neighborhood, and we have decided that anybody who has high income is going to get the loan. So that's our decision policy. And this happens to be also a neighborhood that has majority advantage group, and also that everyone is classified as the advantage group. So everyone got the loan, everyone has high income, everyone is assumed to be of the advantage group. Conversely, in neighborhood B, you have a low income neighborhood, and my decision policy is to reject everyone with low income. So nobody got the loan, everyone is low income. It also happens to be a majority disadvantaged group, and everyone is assumed to be disadvantaged. So next slide, please. If we calculate the total disparity for both neighborhoods together, what we should do is actually count how many people we approved that were white versus the total number of approvals we have for the blacks. But we see that because we don't know the true labels, we can only guess based on the hats. We don't know the actual skin color. And what we see here in this example is that it overestimates. And this overestimate we prove comes from the fact that this neighborhood, which neighborhood you are, create a correlation between race and income. And this income is used in the decision factor. So this is one source of bias. And on the next slide, we'll talk about a different source of bias. So this is what we call intra-geolocation variation. So this same problem, my decision policy is now different. So my decision policy happens to be everybody who is in the advantage group gets the loan. Nobody in the disadvantaged group gets the loan. But I don't know that. It just happens to be that that is the case. But I have the same structure, a high income neighborhood and also separately a low income neighborhood. Now, here, the problem is that the outcome turns out to be perfectly correlated with the true demographics, but it's completely uncorrelated with the predictive feature, which is income, and also the proxy feature, which is which neighborhood you live in. So now what happens in this situation? Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so in this situation, you see that the true disparity is the maximum. It's 100% disparity. Everybody who was in the advantage group got the loan. Nobody in the disadvantaged group got the loan. So this is the maximum disparity we can expect in this example. But in the estimated disparity they were able to calculate, we get a much smaller number. And this underestimate comes from the misclassification error in the imputation process. So you can see that the difference between 9 and 4 is exactly the difference between the people who are wrongly labeled due to the imputation. Next slide, please. We went to look at the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act dataset, which is an anonymized version of every single mortgage application in the country. And we actually do see that mortgages and the rate of acceptances for mortgages do actually have a correlation with race. And we see a negative correlation between being white and accepted and also being Hispanic or Black and being accepted. So we know that this is an actual problem in the real data. Next slide, please. This is a one slide version of like the theoretical analysis we provide in the paper. If you're interested, go have a look. But really what we came to a conclusion of is that the misclassification error drives this statistical bias error. So we are miscalculating the degree of bias because of the way we do the imputation. And there is actually a variation with the threshold. So as we talked about before, previous studies use very high thresholds, high being 80% or higher, because they want a very accurate result. But we actually have massive sample loss, and the sample loss actually correlates with neighborhoods that drive the bias in the other direction. And so this tends to result in overestimate of demographic disparity. But if you change the threshold value, you can actually get the opposite from happening. Next slide. I'll skip this in the interest of time, but this is just the formal statement of what we have, which is really a mess of conditional probabilities that you can look at later. I think I have time to talk about one other paper that so this was written by June, who was my intern in 2020 and his current advisor, Amit Tawaka at Carnegie Mellon. And we're talking about exact and approximate trade-offs between fairness and accuracy. Next slide, please. So I'm not sure how many of you have seen this ProPublica article on bias in recidivism, but this was a very, very famous article, at least in the subgroup of researchers who work in AI fairness and ethics. And I would argue that this has single-handedly driven all the modern interest, the contemporary interest in AI discrimination. Next slide, please. Now, what was initially very confusing for people was that this was the data that they presented as evidence for bias in the recidivism. So you see that the way that they presented this is that it's about the disparity in errors. So people who were labeled high risk by this recidivism algorithm, but actually turned out to not reoffend, was actually biased against African Americans because about 45% of them were labeled high risk but didn't actually reoffend. And the converse being true for whites, that it's more likely for a white person to be labeled as low risk but did reoffend. And this was the justification for their claim that there is racial bias in this algorithm. Next slide, please. what turns out to be a little bit more complicated if you look at the actual confusion matrices for this data is that it depends on which definition of fairness that you use. So the one that they presented was equality of false positive rate and equality of false negative rate fairness. So they're basically saying the false positive rate is different for white and black. The negative rate, the false negative rate, is different for white and black, and so therefore it's unfair. The counter argument from the company was that this was quote unquote the wrong notion of fairness. You should actually be using this notion of fairness in blue, which is demographic parity. And if you actually run the calculation, you see that for this particular definition, there's not a major discrepancy in the actual probabilities of prediction given the underlying truth. So basically, this says that if I correctly predicted that you will reoffend, the rate is the same. Next slide, please. This is just an example of the fact that there are many different quantitative metrics for unfairness, and there are quite a few reviews of what we that review like all the different notions of fairness. There's a very famous tutorial from 2018 that talks about 21 definitions of fairness and their politics, and there's quite a lot of work since to just enumerate how many of them there are. So next slide, please. So this is where we came in, and we were interested in the question of like, how can we simplify this zoo of metrics? And we look, first of all, that a lot of the ones that people talk about mistakes in classification and whether or not there's inequity in those mistakes. And they all have this sort of similar calculus that it's basically conditional probabilities involving three variables: the protected class, the true outcome, and then the predicted outcome. So given this idea, we can go to the next slide. There is something known as the impossibility result in this area. This is a very famous result in the field that you can't have, there's no free lunch. You can't have perfect fairness with respect to multiple notions of fairness simultaneously. What I'm presenting here are the two papers that first pointed this out. First in the regression setting in the first paper, and then in the binary classification setting in the second. And this basically says, here are three different notions of fairness. They cannot be simultaneously satisfied except under certain trivial conditions. So yes, it is trivially true that, for example, if you send everyone to jail, like just decide that everybody goes to jail, like yes, that's trivially true because everyone had the same outcome. But this is obviously not actually practically an interesting situation to look at. Next slide, please. Our observation comes in to say that the probabilities that we compute in practice actually are just simply functions over the confusion matrices that we looked at earlier. So next slide. So first of all, something that I think is very clear is that if you're interested in misclassification and fairness at the same time, you need to look at both the disparity between the prediction and the ground truth variables, but also the demographic label of where you live in. And so this is now a three-dimensional quantity that generalizes the usual confusion matrix to a three-dimensional tensor. And of course, if you're interested in multiple simultaneous notions, so maybe you're interested in race and also gender rather than just gender, then now you're thinking about multiple dimensions to add to this tensor as well. So next slide, please. Our main contribution in this paper is to show that the existing impossibility results can be reduced to actually a very simple problem linear algebra. So recognizing that accuracy is a function over entries of these confusion matrices, and also that group fairness metrics themselves are also functions of entries of these confusion matrices, we can now just start to ask, do there exist confusion matrices that satisfy simultaneous constraints? So a constraint here could look like calibration fairness is perfect, and that's the orange system of equations. Class balance, which are the green and red, constitute different constraints, and also different fairness metrics. So if you just plug all of this in, we showed that the theory of linear programs actually just gets you the compatibility result automatically, and you don't have to do any manual computation using the conditional chain rule in probability theory. Next slide, please. So first of all, this gives us a programmatic way just by simply enumerating all possible linear programs. It gives us a way to generate any number of generalizations of impossibility. So here are all the various sets of fairness that we found are incompatible in the same way. And then next slide, please. So the previous formalism, but just by noting that this is a linear program, is that you also have immediately the approximate relaxation. And this gives you now the natural question of asking, well, I don't know the exact solution, but maybe I can find an approximate solution. And now the approximate solution can be simply defined in like a least square sense or some sort of lossy sense. And that gives you immediately these trade-off curves that you see on the slide. So on this slide, you see, for example, that positive class balance, the ones in purple, we see that these two particular sets of fairnesses are perfectly compatible. It is possible to have a perfectly accurate classifier that satisfies both PCB and CB, for example. Whereas if you look at the green group, you see that positive class balance and demographic parities cannot be perfectly achieved in the adult data set. The best you can do is a 93% accurate classifier, and so on and so forth. So what was interesting here is that the different groups actually, many different classes all behave in a very similar way. So if you look at like equalized odds and demographic parity, this gets you at best a 76% accurate classifier. But then in some sense, like if you're willing to tolerate the 76% accuracy in your classifier, then you can get some other notions of fairness for free. So like positive class balance comes in for free. So if you just read the blue group, you can see that like there are multiple groups that will give you a maximum possible accuracy of the exact same 76%. So this is another example of the analysis that we're able to do just by observing that the fairness and accuracy trade-off that we're interested in is really just some function over confusion matrices. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just let's go for a quick summary since we're nearing the end of time. Next slide, please. I'm really interested in the question of like, how do theoretical ideas address or fail to address the actual practical needs that we see today? So first of all, hopefully I've convinced you that while regulated industries do have explicit needs for fairness and explainability, these regulations are still not sufficient to deal with the complex and ever-changing scenario of using AI. Even if we want to enforce that AI systems that are built in the future are free of bias, we actually need to think about the very practical aspects of whether or not this comes at a compromise that may be ruinously bad for business efficiency. Basically, are we going to lose money if we enforce that everything has to be completely unbiased? And will we drive the development of essentially trivial systems like everyone is not allowed to use this model or everyone is allowed to use it? We also have a little bit of evidence to show that debiasing methods that exist today are not robust, and we have more work to do to remediate bias effectively, although we now have a much better understanding of what algorithmic bias can be defined or quantified as. I think I will just pause here for questions, and thank you everyone for your time, and apologies again for the AV issues. Thank you so much, Stacy, for driving the slides. We'll maybe break here for questions.
Any questions? No questions?
You should have question.
Please.
You want to go ahead and ask question? You're muted. So I may ask question until others are going to be warming up. So moving forward, what sort of other challenges you think that the AI community should focus and answer to this state of the art slightly forward and try to address those sort of issues? What do you think is going to be the major challenge that should focus in this fairness aspect?
Sure. So I think to me, one of the big gaps in the current research is actually a systems level design. So for example, we talked about compliance and bias testing, but in order to measure the bias, you need the data. But so there's just like the very pragmatic question of what happens when you can't collect the data. So this was the second section of my talk, but also thinking about what if people refuse to be identified because they are actually concerned for their safety. So maybe I'm not concerned about people knowing if I am male or female, or that I'm Asian, but maybe I care if people know that I have a mental disability, or maybe I'm transgender, or something like that. So just disclosing that I belong to this marginalized group might be uncomfortable for me to disclose. And the problem here is that we need to disclose this in order for any organization to compute the unfairness metrics. And so I think there's some interesting work that I started at JP Morgan. We're trying to write it up now. It's on understanding the privacy trade-off between fairness testing and self-disclosure. So one of the surprising results that we got is that it is actually possible under most cases to develop a privacy preserving way to compute bias. So I can generate a protocol where I can never tell you the labels that I have, but it is actually possible to get a sufficiently accurate measure for bias that we can actually use, and we know provably what the errors associated with them are.
You.
Any other questions? I have a question for you.
Please.
It's very interesting, the context that you presented your information in, and you're talking about bias, but in other research or development areas where AI is being used, where you have to be able to consider what kind of factors could be considered bias, when things like race or gender are not necessarily part of the equation for what you're solving for, but it could be other factors. For instance, we do a lot of things with autonomous vehicles and things like that. So maybe some of the areas, and I'm just throwing this out, it isn't necessarily bias with color or gender. It could be that maybe we're inclined to believe that, let's say if we're flying a plane in clear skies, more than likely there are no issues or problems, and we're not really considering, I know that's a really bad example, but we're not considering certain biases or making the assumption that when the sky is blue or the sky is clear, then necessarily everything is fine. Does that make sense? Do you understand my question?
Yeah. I can comment on some aspect of this. So maybe I'll give a different example. So if you're building an AI system for a self-driving car, maybe you need to build a system to notice if somebody is jaywalking, right? Because obviously, if someone is crossing the street when they're supposed to, okay, I have other evidence like the traffic light to tell me like, okay, I don't expect pedestrians, but we know people jaywalk. So I may now develop an AI system to figure out if anybody is walking across the street, regardless of traffic light. And now you're in this problem of pose estimation for humans. And now we can also imagine that somebody may with good intentions, say something like, oh, okay, I need like a diversity of data about who crosses the street and how they cross the street. So now I'm thinking about, oh, maybe I need people who walk across the street in this way. Maybe they move their arms in this way, they move their shoulders in this way. But then I also need maybe a representative sample. So what I'm saying here is in this situation, you can run the risk of stereotype bias. So now you're interested in people who stereotypically walk in a quote unquote male way, masculine way, or feminine way. And this is where I think you start running into unintended consequences where you're not directly conditioning my self-driving car or like pedestrian detection model on race or gender, but maybe in fact I may have inadvertently done so by the particular kind of sample of people whose data I have on the post estimation. Does that make sense, or is that maybe addressing
Yes,
something different?
yes. I know my question was kind of broad and vague, but yes, you have addressed it by putting it in that context. Thank you.
One other question from my side is there are some of these kind of things that we are discussing is primarily toward the research community that have to be addressed. But when it comes to the legal perspectives and sort of in that domains, so how those sort of challenges to be addressed there, to what level and how that should be addressed. I think that's going to be quite challenging because that's going to be very controversial, and how it's going to be form a basis for legally say, hey, it's discriminatory or it's not fair or what sort of things that is going to be happening. So how we can make a basis for that sort of judgments.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought this up because this was why I spent so much time at the beginning talking about the legal theories of discrimination. So first of all, one caveat is that what I've discussed is very US specific. So the UK or Canada or other countries, they don't have quite the same notions of discrimination. I would say one of the big drivers of differences is, well, obviously, like protected classes are not all the same. So in the UK, they lump race and religion together as a protected class. But also just like what constitutes discrimination? So a lot of some jurisdictions only care about direct discrimination, like you build a model that includes race. Okay, we don't allow that. But you can build a model that has zip code because I don't see it as a problem. But now this is a question of potentially introducing indirect discrimination in the model. So there's a lot of divergence in terms of what is legal and not legal when it comes to these more subtle forms of potential discrimination. For those of us who reside in the US, I definitely encourage everyone to participate and give feedback to regulators and federal agencies. One thing that I've been very pleasantly surprised by is how much public input they're soliciting. So NIST, for example, is putting out a new federal standard for quantifying and managing risks associated with AI systems. They have issued public requests for comment, so they have actually invited the public to comment at multiple stages on how we should design this legislation, regulatory guidance, and those kinds of things. So lawmakers are creating new bills. Existing agencies are building new regulatory guidance. I've mentioned that consumer finance regulations are very old, they're out of date. They know that. They've actually issued their requests for input. So even though some of these have closed, others have not yet been released, but I definitely encourage people to get in touch. If you're a US citizen, I highly encourage you to go talk to your local congressperson and say that, I work in AI and I'm really concerned about this and that. And, like these laws and things that people are coming up with, like I want input on this, I want your support on this. So what I'm saying here is that the government is putting a lot of attention on modernizing these laws and creating new laws when there's no oversight. And they want these new laws to be informed by the best available research and knowledge that we have today. So this is I think a call for action to say that we don't have to think of the law as just some passive constraint that is just handed down from somebody, and then that's all we are allowed to do about it. I think if anyone's interested, now is exactly the right time to provide this feedback to the governments. I think I'll also mention that I think coming from an HPCU, I think this kind of input is especially valuable because it's just bringing that very unique perspective that you all have by being part of a group that's historically underrepresented, and I think they would take that in kind of input much more seriously.
Any other question?
Please.
Yeah, I think it's now already 4:08. Would like to thank that's something the way that
Excuse me, Dr. Karamudin, I have one more question if we have the time for it.
yeah, go ahead.
All right. Thank you for the amazing presentation, Dr. Shen. I would have to apologize because I was only able to attend the last 30 minutes of it. I was just getting out of a final exam. So my research interest also involves explainable AI. And I kind of noticed that you mentioned a trade-off between fairness and accuracy of a model, right?
Yes.
And so I was wondering if one way that some people are trying to address this issue, especially Dr. Cynthia Rudin of Duke University, is to replace some of these industry-grade black box models by interpretable models that are as accurate. So for instance, in the field of recidivism, the COMPAS model, which is famously being used in court systems currently, she demonstrated an interpretable model which actually behaved more accurately than that COMPAS model. And so could a way to de-bias these models, could we be building like an interpretable model that are inherently fair to be able, as one way or as one option to de-bias these types of areas? Or
Yeah, yeah, thanks for the question. So I didn't really touch very much on explanation or interpretability, but I would. So first of all, like if you don't have the link to the slides, please feel free to reach out because I put them on Google Slides. But one of the examples I gave earlier was a credit decision policy that is simply just deciding based on your credit score. So if your credit score is good, I give you a credit card. Otherwise, I don't give you a credit card. So I think you would argue, hopefully, that this is as interpretable as it gets. There's one feature, I know exactly the threshold to get the decision. But even in that case, it's actually possible to argue that this is still a bias model because of the intrinsic and latent biases in the distribution of that data. So we talked about how the distribution of credit scores actually has a historical bias. It also has racial bias. And so just the fact that I'm using one feature and I'm telling you exactly the data distribution of this feature, and I'm telling you exactly what threshold I'm used, you can still have a situation where like it's still clearly biased if you're using it. So I think interpretability in general could help, but even in the most extreme case of a very simple model, you can still argue that there is still going to be some bias that cannot be removed just by being interpretable. So I also mentioned that like in the field of explainable AI, like there are definitely people like Cynthia who say you should only use inherently explainable models, and this is also something that that I know at least one financial institution. So there's a model risk team at Wells Fargo that has been also pushing a very similar view, and they have publicly published this information. So you can go look it up if you're interested. It's definitely important from like a risk perspective to say, like, do I understand what this model is doing so I can understand when will it fail and how badly will it fail? So from a risk management problem, it is definitely very valuable. However, if the question is specifically about risks that is introduced by discrimination, I think the answer is not so clear, that it's neither necessary nor sufficient.
thank you.
you. So, any other question before adjourning today's meeting? Thank you so much for today's talk and bringing us new perspective to the this research on AI, and was very informative. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it personally.
Thank you again for having me, and please feel free to email me if you have any questions.